J.D. Vance faced 5 hosts, each armed with sharp words and knowing smirks. As millions of Americans watched from their living rooms, the View's studio gleamed under the harsh lights, but what echoed louder than the cameras were the hosts' open mockery of small towns, of the working-class communities that built this nation. And then, in seconds that felt like an eternity, everything changed. With one steady voice, J.D. silenced the room, the laughter, the jeers. But what did he say? What truth did he speak that left not just a studio, but a nation unable to look away? As you listen, remember this. While the details of this story are dramatized, the heart of it, the pride, the struggle, the dignity of forgotten towns and working families, is very real. This is not just a tale of what might have been. It's a reflection of what so many have lived, felt, and continue to fight for. Let the emotion guide you, because sometimes a story can carry us closer to the truth than facts alone ever could. Stay with us. This is more than a story. It's a reminder of who we are and who we can still choose to be. The sun was sinking behind the Washington skyline, casting a burnt orange glow over the marble dome of the Capitol. Inside his Senate office, J.D. Vance sat alone at his desk, the room bathed in that fleeting light of dusk, that hour where the city held its breath before night took over. His steelworker's pin glinted on the corner of his lapel, the only piece of his past he wore daily, a quiet reminder of where he came from. Stacks of legislation, unread memos, and briefing folders lay scattered before him, but J.D.'s gaze was distant. He watched the flag outside ripple in the soft evening breeze and thought, as he often did at this hour, of the small towns he'd promised to fight for. The towns where porch lights flickered over cracked sidewalks, where factories once hummed and now stood silent. A soft knock broke his reverie. The door creaked open, and a young staffer, maybe 25, fresh out of school, sharp suit slightly too big for his frame, stepped in, clutching a manila envelope like it might burn him. "Senator, this just came for you. I, wasn't sure if I should even bring it." J.D. raised a brow, motioning him in. "What's got you looking like you've seen a ghost?" The staffer crossed the room, set the envelope down like it might explode, and stepped back. J.D. opened it slowly, methodically, as he did everything. Inside, a single cream-colored card embossed in gold. The View cordially invites Senator J.D. Vance as a featured guest on our next live broadcast. He stared at the card. The edges felt heavier than they should, like the weight of it carried more than just paper, like it carried a warning. The young staffer cleared his throat. "We don't have to respond. I can say you're unavailable. I mean, they probably want to." J.D. held up a hand, silencing him gently. His eyes narrowed, scanning the city beyond the glass. "They don't want a conversation," J.D. said, almost to himself. His voice was low, edged with something harder than frustration. "They want a target, a spectacle." The staffer hesitated. "Sir, with respect, they've torn up senators twice your senior, governors, businessmen. If you go on there, they'll try to corner you, make you look like a fool in front of the country." J.D. smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe, or maybe I remind the country what we're fighting for." But even as he said it, doubt curled in his chest. J.D. imagined the set, the lights, the hosts with their polished nails and sharper tongues. He saw the smirks, the interruptions, the gotcha questions, and he saw himself sitting there defending the places he loved, trying to speak for people who'd never be invited to that studio, and wondering if his words would even land. The room felt colder somehow, the dusk deeper. Was this a trap he shouldn't walk into? Or was it the fight he'd been preparing for all along? The staffer lingered, waiting. J.D. could feel the unspoken question hanging in the air, and beneath it, deeper still, the question he asked himself every day. Do I have the courage to say yes, knowing what it will cost? His fingers tapped once, twice on the edge of the desk. The city lights flickered on, one by one, as if urging him to decide. Finally, J.D. exhaled, slow, steady, like a man settling his soul before a storm. "Draft my response," he said. "Tell them I accept." And in that moment, As night claimed the city and the Capitol dome glowed against the dark, J.D. Vance chose not safety, but purpose. What he didn't know, what no one in that office knew, was how that single choice would set off a chain of moments America would never forget. The words had barely left J.D.'s mouth. "Tell them I accept," when the weight of that decision began to settle on him, heavy as the night pressing against his office window. The city beyond was now cloaked in darkness, its monuments glowing like lonely sentinels in the distance. The room felt stifling, the air thick with the ghosts of choices made and those yet to come. Without a word, J.D. grabbed his coat, stepped into the night, and let the chill of the air clear his head. Washington at this hour was a different world, quieter, stripped of its daytime roar of engines and voices. J.D. walked aimlessly at first, the marble buildings looming like giant reminders of promises made to people far from this place. His shoes echoed against the empty streets, the rhythm steady, almost meditative, as his mind drifted, unbidden, to the world he'd left behind. He saw it first in his mind's eye, the shuttered steel mill that had been the heartbeat of his hometown. By day, as a boy, he'd stared through its rusted gates, watching weeds push through the cracked concrete where men had once walked with purpose. At night, he'd heard his mother's quiet sobs at the kitchen table, thinking he was asleep, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, her face drawn with worry, trying to stretch what little they had. And then always there was Papa, his grandfather's hands, scarred and strong, lifting J.D. onto his lap, brushing the dirt from his jeans after a hard day. J.D. could still feel the rough calluses, the smell of grease and metal that clung to him. A smell that spoke of dignity earned, not given. These weren't just memories. They were pieces of him, stitched into his very bones. And tonight, they walked with him under the pale glow of street lamps, as real as the chill in the air. J.D.'s pace slowed as he reached the edge of a small park, empty now, save for a single flag rippling in the breeze. He stopped, staring at it, red, white, and blue, worn at the edges, but still standing. Much like the places he came from, much like the people who'd raised him. He thought of them now, not just his family, but the neighbors, the teachers, the factory workers, the veterans who filled the front porches on summer nights, who lined Main Street for the 4th of July, who prayed quietly for better days. People who'd given everything they had and yet were spoken of in this city and in studios like the one he was about to walk into, as if they were relics of a time best forgotten. J.D. felt the anger rise, slow and steady, but not wild. This wasn't fury for fury's sake. It was the fire of responsibility, of knowing that silence was no longer an option. He took a breath, his eyes still fixed on the flag, and in the hush of that city night, he whispered to the wind, maybe to himself, maybe to all who would listen. Someone has to say it. And with that quiet vow hanging in the air, J.D. turned back toward the Capitol's distant dome, its lights still burning through the dark, and began the long walk back, his mind already bracing for the storm to come. What he couldn't yet know was just how deeply his words would cut through that storm, and how they would echo far beyond the walls of a television studio. Morning came slowly, as if reluctant to break the weight of the night. J.D. had slept little. The images of home, of duty, of the flag under the street lamp lingering in his mind like echoes of an unfinished promise. By dawn, his path felt clearer, though his heart carried the heaviness of what lay ahead. The chill of the morning air did little to lift it as he made his way to a small veterans' hall on the edge of town. The kind of place easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but impossible to forget once you'd been inside. It was a simple building, brick worn smooth by time, the flag out front a little faded but flying proud. Inside, the smell of coffee, too strong, too bitter, mixed with the comforting warmth of bacon on the griddle. Folding chairs scraped against the old floor as men and women, some in uniform, most in well-worn jackets and caps that told their own stories, gathered around mismatched tables. This wasn't about ceremony or politics. It was about fellowship, about remembering. J.D. moved quietly through the room, nodding to faces he knew, offering handshakes that lingered just a little longer than usual. These were his people, the ones who didn't ask for the spotlight, who carried burdens most would never see, who knew sacrifice in a way few in Washington ever could. He filled a paper cup with black coffee and was about to take a seat near the back when he felt a hand, firm and weathered, on his arm. He turned and found himself looking into the eyes of a man who seemed carved from the same steel as the factories J.D. had dreamed of the night before. His hair was white, his back slightly stooped, but his gaze was steady, unflinching. "Senator," the old veteran said, voice rough like gravel but sure, "I hear you're going on that show, the one where they laugh at folks like us." J.D. hesitated, sensing the weight in the man's words. "They mock us on TV," the vet continued, his grip tightening just slightly, as if to will his message deeper. "They sit in those studios with their polished shoes and their easy smiles, and they think they know better. But they don't know us. Not really. Someone's got to show them what we are." The room had quieted around them. Conversation slowed, forks paused midair, as if the small hall itself was holding its breath. J.D. looked at the man, at the small scar that ran along his temple, at the hands that had surely carried more than their share of weight. He thought of his mother's tears, his grandfather's calloused palms, the hollowed mill, the porch lights flickering in forgotten towns. And in that moment, all the doubt, all the sleepless questioning of the night before, fell away. His shoulders straightened, his jaw set, not in anger, but in quiet purpose. "I'll go," J.D. said, his voice firm, the words carrying across the room like a promise. "I won't let them laugh at us again." The old vet gave a single nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. J.D. felt the eyes of the room on him, not judging, not questioning, just watching, trusting. As he left the hall and stepped into the rising sun, the city beyond the horizon seemed less distant, the task ahead less daunting. For J.D. Vance, the decision was no longer his alone. It belonged to all those he carried with him. And as he walked, he knew the next chapter of this fight had already begun. The morning sun had barely climbed above the rooftops when J.D.'s car pulled to a slow stop outside the studio. The city felt different here, slicker somehow, polished and humming with a kind of energy that didn't come from factories or fields, but from cameras, makeup chairs, and whispered orders through earpieces. As J.D. stepped out, the smell of concrete and car exhaust mixed with the faint aroma of expensive coffee drifting from nearby cafes. He straightened his jacket, took a steadying breath, and crossed the threshold into the world of lights and lenses. The change was immediate. The quiet resolve of the Veterans Hall was gone, replaced by the whir of cameras being tested, the clatter of hurried footsteps on sleek floors, the murmur of last-minute instructions barked into headsets. Bright lights beamed down from overhead rigs, casting everything in a glow that was almost too perfect. A glow meant to flatter, to dazzle, to hide the sharp edges beneath the surface. J.D.'s boots felt heavy against the polished tile as he walked past sets dressed to look casual. A bookshelf filled with titles no one had read. A coffee table with neatly arranged magazines no one would open. The air was cool, crisp with recycled climate control, and carried the faint trace of hairspray and stage makeup. A young assistant approached, tablet in hand, smile wide and practiced. "Senator Vance, welcome. We're so glad to have you today." The words rolled off her tongue smoothly, but J.D. heard the edge beneath them, the tone of someone who had said the same line to a dozen guests before him, and would say it a dozen more after. He returned the smile, tight but polite. "Glad to be here," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. As they guided him through the maze of corridors and cables, J.D. took it all in. The cameras, massive and mechanical, seemed to track him even when they weren't rolling. Crew members offered nods and clipped greetings, their eyes already moving to the next task before he could respond. From somewhere deeper in the studio came a burst of laughter, rehearsed, hollow, the sound of people warming up for the real performance soon to come. Finally, they reached the edge of the set. J.D. could see the desk, the chairs, the backdrop designed to feel welcoming and intimate, though everything about it was calculated down to the inch. The hosts were there already, chatting softly among themselves, faces lit by the glow of screens showing their own reflections. A producer, older, sharp-eyed, approached from the side, clipboard clutched like a shield. He leaned in, voice low, just for JD. "Try to keep it light," he said, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "The audience likes a little tension, but nothing too heavy." JD gave a tight nod, though inside the words rang like a warning. Light? There was nothing light about what he'd come to say. He stepped toward the set, the cameras adjusting their gaze, the lights seeming to burn a little brighter now. The assistant gestured to his seat, and as JD sat, he felt the weight of it all, the weight of what was expected of him, and the heavier weight of what he intended to deliver. From beyond the cameras, the countdown began. 3, 2, 1. And as the show's theme music filled the air, JD Vance prepared to step fully into the arena. What no one on that set could know was that this wasn't going to be the kind of interview they were used to, and nothing about what was about to unfold would stay light for long. The theme music faded, and the camera's red lights blinked to life like watching eyes. JD shifted in his chair, his back straight, his hands folded loosely on the table, as the host turned toward him with practiced ease, all warmth on the surface, but JD could feel the sharpness beneath. It was in their eyes, bright and alert, measuring him even as they smiled. It was in the slight tilt of a head, the subtle glance exchanged between them, as if reminding each other to stay on script. "Senator Vance," the lead host began, her voice smooth as glass, "we're thrilled you could join us today. You've had quite a year. Legislation, headlines, and now joining us here at The View." JD offered a small nod, polite but cautious. "Glad to be here," he said, though the words felt no truer now than they had backstage. Another host, younger, with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes, leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table in a gesture meant to look casual. "We were just saying before you came on, it's refreshing to have someone from what you call forgotten America with us. We don't always get that perspective." The others chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be cruel, but wasn't kind either. JD heard it for what it was, the first shot across the bow. He met their gaze, steady and calm, resisting the urge to shift in his seat. "Well," he said evenly, "I appreciate the invitation." The small talk continued, each question and comment layered with compliments that felt like they'd been dipped in something sharper. They spoke of bipartisanship, of bridge building, of how important it is to bring everyone to the table. And then, as JD had expected, the conversation turned. It came from the host with the brightest smile, the kind of smile that disarmed just before the blade slipped in. "Senator Vance," she said, her tone light but the words pointed, "you've built a reputation fighting for these small towns. But isn't it fair to ask, why cling to dying places? Shouldn't we be helping people move on rather than holding them back?" The air in the studio seemed to shift, the hum of cameras growing louder in JD's ears. This was the moment they'd planned for. The moment the small-town senator could be framed as nostalgic, as out of step, as the man too attached to the past to see the future. JD felt it. The bait, laid out so cleanly, so inviting. He could feel the eyes of the audience beyond the cameras waiting, the weight of every man and woman from the towns they spoke of resting on his shoulders. He took a slow breath, choosing not to rush his words. This wasn't the moment to strike. Not yet. "I believe in helping people build futures where their roots are," JD said, voice measured, firm but not defensive. "Sometimes moving on isn't the only answer." The hosts exchanged glances, sensing, perhaps, that the first blow had not quite landed. JD let the pause hang there, feeling the tension build, waiting for the next move. The game had begun, but JD Vance knew better than to play it on their terms. The pause that followed JD's measured answer felt longer than it was. The hosts, so used to quick comebacks and easy applause, seemed briefly thrown by his restraint, by the quiet confidence in his words. But the stillness didn't last. One of the co-hosts, the one who had stayed mostly silent until now, perhaps saving her strike for just the right moment, leaned forward, tilting her head in that practiced way that suggested curiosity but delivered something sharper. Her smile was wide, her tone light, as if she were tossing off a harmless joke. "Well, Senator," she said, her voice carrying across the set and straight into the audience's ears, "who even lives in these places anymore?" The words hit the air like a spark to dry grass. For a second, there was silence, the kind that comes before the break. Then the laughter started. Soft at first, a few chuckles here and there, then louder, spreading across the studio like a wave. The hosts joined in, some with genuine amusement, others because that was what was expected. The sound filled the space, bounced off the polished surfaces, made the bright lights seem a little harsher, the room a little smaller. JD didn't move at first. His hands stayed where they were, fingers resting lightly on the table's edge. But beneath the surface, his grip tightened, slow and firm, until his knuckles whitened against the wood. The camera, ever watchful, caught the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders squared, the flicker of steel in his gaze. To the audience watching at home, it was a glimpse of the storm building beneath his calm exterior. The laughter echoed a moment longer, and then began to fade, leaving behind the kind of quiet that asks, "What now?" JD looked not at the hosts, not at the producer off to the side, not at the cue cards resting on the desk. He looked straight into the lens, straight through it, as if he could reach the living rooms, the kitchens, the break rooms of every American watching. And then he spoke, his voice steady, not loud, but carrying the weight of all those he'd come to represent. "Let me tell you about them," he said. The room seemed to still, the shift so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, but it was there. The hosts exchanged glances, the easy rhythm they'd counted on now interrupted. JD's tone left no space for laughter. It offered no safe return to small talk. For the first time since the cameras rolled, the stage belonged to him. And as JD Vance prepared to speak, to truly speak, about the people behind the places they'd mocked, about the faces and families and sacrifices that didn't fit neatly into studio soundbites, the nation, too, seemed to lean in. What began as a laugh was about to become something very different. The stillness after JD's quiet challenge, "Let me tell you about them," was fragile, as if the studio itself was unsure whether to breathe. But the moment didn't last. One host, then another, leaned in, seizing the pause not as a chance to listen, but as a chance to regain control. The panel doubled down, their tones lighter on the surface but edged with something harder, something meant to box him in. "Senator," one co-host said, her voice lilting as if offering a friendly nudge, "no one here questions your sincerity, but aren't these policies you push just nostalgia dressed as patriotism? I mean, let's be honest, maybe the future isn't in these small towns at all." Another added, almost as if to soften the blow but sharpening it instead, "We respect tradition, but isn't it time to look forward, not backward?" Their words rippled through the studio, polite in form, dismissive in meaning. JD felt the weight of them, felt how easily they could paint him as clinging to the past, as a man standing in the way of progress. The lights seemed hotter now, the air thicker, though he knew that was just the blood rushing in his ears. His heart pounded, hard, steady, but his face didn't betray it. His voice, when it came, stayed calm. "I think," JD began, choosing each word with care, "that sometimes what we call the future is just the past dressed in new clothes, and that's not always progress." But even as he spoke, part of him wasn't in that studio at all. Part of him was standing beneath a gray sky years ago at the small cemetery on the edge of his hometown. He saw again the worn headstone, the folding chairs on the patchy grass, the flag handed to his aunt with quiet words of thanks that rang hollow against the reality they all knew. His uncle's funeral had been a simple affair. No speeches from senators, no crowds beyond family and friends who'd watched a good man lose his way when the mill closed, when the jobs dried up, when the dignity of work was taken and nothing came to replace it. JD could still feel the cold that day, could still see the lines on his uncle's face. Lines carved deeper by worry than by age. A man broken not by one tragedy, but by 1,000 small losses, the kind no headline ever tells. JD blinked, returning to the present, to the studio where faces watched him, waiting for him to falter. But he didn't. He wouldn't. He let the pause stretch just long enough to remind them, and the millions watching, that his words came not from theory, but from life lived. These towns, these people, JD continued, voice steady, gaze unwavering, they're not relics. They're not obstacles to progress. They're Americans who've paid the price for someone else's version of progress. And they deserve more than to be laughed at or written off. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath again, the weight of his truth pushing against the polished surface of the conversation. JD knew they'd try again, that the game wasn't over. But for now, the tide had shifted, even if just a little. And beneath it all, the memory of his uncle stood with him, a silent reminder of why he could not, would not, back down. The hush after JD's quiet rebuke didn't last. The panel, practiced in the art of steering conversations back to familiar ground, recovered quickly. One of the hosts let out a soft chuckle, as if trying to lighten what had become too heavy for their comfort. But JD pressed on, his voice steady, his words carrying the weight of those he refused to let be forgotten. "I wish you could see what I've seen," JD said, leaning forward slightly, hands clasped before him, the lights glinting off the simple steel pin on his lapel. "Families who lost everything when the factories closed. Homes with windows boarded up, not because people gave up, but because the world gave up on them. Empty tables where dinner used to be, and kids who learned too soon how to go without." He spoke without notes, without polish, just truth. And for a moment it felt like the room might shift with him, might finally see what he saw. But then came the interruption. One of the hosts, the same who had laughed before, leaned back in her chair, smirking as if amused by a child's stubbornness. "Senator, we get it, but everyone has to move on at some point, don't they? That's life." Her words floated out, light as air, but heavy in their dismissal. Another host gave a soft shrug, as if to say the matter was simple, obvious, not worth the weight JD tried to give it. JD felt it then, a heat rising from deep within, not loud, not wild, but steady and fierce. His jaw tightened, his heart pounded against his ribs, and for a brief moment, he felt the full gravity of everyone he spoke for pressing down on him. The fathers who couldn't bring themselves to look their kids in the eye after a shiftless day. The mothers who balanced bills at the kitchen table, trying to stretch what wouldn't stretch. The workers who stood outside locked gates, staring at rusted signs that used to mean something. He felt their disappointment, their anger, their dignity bruised but not broken. And he felt his own, the deep, burning frustration at seeing their struggle reduced to a soundbite, their worth dismissed with a shrug. But JD didn't let the rage speak. He let it steady him. He let it remind him that this wasn't about him at all. His gaze swept the table, his voice calm when he spoke, though beneath that calm the fire still burned. It's easy to say move on when the ground beneath your feet hasn't been ripped out from under you, when your hometown isn't a headline people have forgotten, when your kids don't go to sleep hungry. The room grew quieter, but the host's smiles didn't vanish entirely. JD saw it, the effort to keep the segment light, to keep control of the narrative. But the crack was there now, small but real, in the polished facade. JD let the silence linger, let it say what words couldn't, feeling the weight of every small-town porch, every shuttered mill, every empty chair at every kitchen table. He wouldn't let them be laughed off, not here, not today. And as the cameras kept rolling, the tension in the air was no longer just his to carry. The studio's polished world, all bright lights and easy banter, felt different now. Thinner somehow, like the glossy surface had begun to crack under the weight of what JD refused to let be ignored. The hosts, still wearing their practiced smiles, shifted slightly in their chairs, as if trying to decide whether to press forward or pull back. The audience, sensing the shift, grew quieter, the earlier laughter now a memory hanging awkwardly in the air. JD didn't rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch just long enough to remind everyone that not every space has to be filled with words, and that sometimes truth speaks loudest when no one dares interrupt. His gaze lifted, steady and unwavering. One by one, he looked each host in the eye. There was no anger in his expression now, no sharpness, just resolve. The kind forged in steel mills and small-town kitchens, The kind that doesn't rise on impulse but is built, layer by layer, out of duty. The cameras, ever hungry, captured the moment. J.D. Vance, still and strong, meeting their gaze not with fury, but with something that demanded to be heard. He drew in a slow, deep breath, as if settling something within himself, as if choosing this next turn with the same care a man chooses his final card in a high-stakes hand. His voice, when it came, was even, quiet but caring, a voice that didn't need volume to command the room. "Enough," he said, the word falling into the space like a stone into still water. "Let me tell you what progress really looks like." There it was, the line that drew a boundary, that turned the moment from performance into something real. The mood shifted, the smirk softened. The hosts, so quick with quips and questions, found themselves without a ready reply. Even the crew beyond the cameras seemed to still, as if some unspoken rule had been broken, or remade, in that instant. The audience leaned in, sensing that what came next wasn't part of the script, wasn't the back and forth they'd come to expect. J.D. could feel it too, the quiet before the storm. That fragile, charged pause before words land that can't be taken back, before truths are spoken that demand more than applause or argument. And in that moment, in that breath, the studio no longer belonged to its hosts or its cameras. It belonged to J.D. Vance, and to the people he carried with him. As the lights burned hot overhead and the nation watched, J.D. Vance prepared to show them what progress meant. Not in theory, not in sound bites, but in the faces and lives too long ignored. What started as a segment was about to become a reckoning. J.D.'s words hung in the air. "Let me tell you what progress really looks like." And for a moment, the studio seemed to hold its breath. The hosts, caught between their next question and the unexpected gravity of his tone, stayed silent. The cameras tightened their focus. Somewhere beyond the bright lights, the nation leaned in. J.D.'s voice remained calm, but its steadiness carried the weight of memory, of place, of truth forged in fires far from the comfort of a studio. "There's a town in Ohio," he began, his gaze distant now, as if seeing it in his mind as clearly as he once saw it from the window of a beat-up truck. "Small place. You wouldn't find it on most maps unless you were looking. The kind of town people like to say is finished, written off as part of the past." He paused, letting the image form for them, for everyone watching. There was a steel mill there, the heart of that town. For decades, it gave families purpose, fed their kids, put roofs over their heads, sent their sons and daughters to school. And then one day, the gates shut, the machines went quiet, the sirens stopped, and the town, well, it didn't just lose jobs, it lost part of its soul. J.D.'s eyes stayed on the hosts, but his words seemed meant for someone beyond them, someone beyond the studio walls. "I remember driving past that mill. I remember the gates, rusted now, weeds pushing up through the cracks in the concrete, like nature itself trying to reclaim what we abandoned. I remember the silence, the kind that feels heavy, like grief you can't speak." The image was clear, painted not in broad strokes, but in the kind of detail that comes from having stood there, from having felt the loss in your bones. The studio was quiet, the earlier rhythm of banter forgotten. "But then," J.D. continued, and now his voice carried a lift, the faintest rise of hope. "Something happened. People didn't give up. They organized, fought for investment, worked with state and local leaders. And one day, after more than 10 years, those gates opened again." He could see it as he spoke. Sirens blared, not the sirens of emergency, but of return. Families lined the streets, cheering. Fathers brought their kids to see what it looked like when hope comes back. The machines roared to life, and the hum of that steel mill, that hum was the sound of progress. J.D. let the silence that followed speak for him for a beat, giving space for the image to settle, for the weight of it to land. "That's progress," he said quietly, his gaze firm. "Not turning our backs, not writing people off, not saying move on because it's easier than fighting for what's right. That mill, that town, they didn't need to be left behind. They needed a chance, and they took it." The room was still. The hosts without quick replies, the cameras capturing more than a moment. They were capturing a truth rarely given voice on stages like this. JD hadn't just answered their question, he'd redefined it, and the storm he'd promised with his calm declaration was now upon them. JD's final words about the mill's revival still hung in the air, their weight filling the quiet that followed. The hosts, so quick with their questions earlier, sat still now. No interruptions, no playful jabs. The audience beyond the cameras, the nation beyond the screen. They too seemed to wait, drawn into the world JD painted, where hope wasn't abstract and progress wasn't measured in applause lines but in lives rebuilt. JD didn't rush. He let the stillness hold for a breath, then leaned forward, his voice soft but carrying, as if inviting the room closer. And it wasn't just the mill that came back to life, it was the people. Let me tell you about them. Because progress isn't just steel and machinery, it's faces, it's families, it's names worth remembering. He met the host's eyes one by one as he spoke. Not challenging, but sharing something that mattered. There's Miguel, a single dad. He'd been out of work so long he stopped counting the months, but he never stopped packing his son's lunch every morning, even when he didn't know what he'd put on the table that night. First in line when the mill reopened. First to clock in. He's there now, working double shifts so his boy can have what he didn't. JD let the image settle before continuing, the names not rehearsed but real to him. There's Susan. She lost her husband to cancer a year after the mill shut down. No insurance, no pension, just medical bills that came like waves. Folks in town thought she'd leave, start over somewhere else. But she stayed. When the mill came back, she took over HR, not just hiring, but making sure no one got left behind. The widows, the vets, the ones who'd nearly given up. His voice steadied, the fire now tempered with something gentler. And then there's Dave, Army vet, 3 tours overseas, came home to find his town hollowed out, the job he'd counted on gone. He spent years fixing cars in his driveway to scrape by. When that mill reopened, Dave was one of the first back on the line. Said it felt like putting on a uniform again, like being part of something bigger than himself. The studio remained silent except for JD's voice. No smirks, no shrugs, no clever retorts. Just listening, the kind that happens when there's nothing left to hide behind. JD drew a slow breath, letting the names linger, the weight of them doing what no argument could. People like Miguel, Susan, and Dave, they don't ask for handouts. They don't want pity. They want dignity, a chance to work, a chance to build something that lasts. He paused, his gaze steady. That's what our legislation aimed for. Not to save a mill, but to save what that mill gave people. A reason to stay, a reason to believe their town wasn't done. Their lives weren't forgotten. And as JD's words settled over the room, it was no longer just policy or debate. It was a reminder, a call. What had started as a segment had become something else entirely. A moment that neither the hosts nor the viewers would easily walk away from. JD's final words. A reason to stay, a reason to believe their town wasn't done, their lives weren't forgotten, settled over the studio like a weight no one had expected to feel that morning. For a long beat, nothing stirred. The bright lights burned on, the cameras rolled, but the easy rhythm of banter, the practiced cues for laughter or applause, were gone. The camera operators, always trained to search for a reaction, did their work. The lens framed the hosts, faces that only minutes earlier had been animated with quips and smiles now stilled. The smirks had faded. The glances they exchanged weren't of amusement anymore, but of uncertainty, as if each was waiting for the other to break the silence first. The tension wasn't the kind born of conflict or raised voices. It was heavier than that, more real. It was the tension of being reminded, too vividly, too undeniably, of truths that no amount of polish or performance could cover. JD could feel it, the shift. The ground beneath the conversation no longer belonged to the game of sound bites and scripted questions. It belonged to what was real, what mattered. He leaned forward slightly, not in aggression, but in quiet insistence. His voice low but clear, meant not just for the hosts at his table, but for the millions watching beyond the screen. These towns, he said, his gaze steady, his words measured, they aren't dead. They're America's backbone, if we let them be. The words fell into the space like a bell's chime in the stillness, and with them came something no one on that stage had planned for. From the audience, tucked just beyond the glare of the studio lights, came a sound. Soft at first, a single pair of hands coming together in applause. Then another, and another. The host sat motionless for a second longer, as if unsure whether to ride the wave or resist it. But the wave had begun. The clapping grew, hesitant but building, not thunderous, not the forced applause of cue cards or prompts, but real, the sound of people responding not to a performance, but to something true that had touched them. JD didn't smile. He didn't bask in the moment. He let it be what it was, a small, fragile acknowledgement that the truth, when spoken plainly, can cut through even the noisiest of rooms. The applause grew steadier, and with it, the mood shifted further. The studio, so designed for comfort and control, felt different now. Less like a stage, more like a place where something genuine had broken through. One of the hosts at last cleared her throat, her voice softer now, the edge gone. "Senator," she said almost quietly, "we appreciate that perspective." JD nodded, not in victory, but in thanks. Not to the host, but to the moment itself, to the space that had allowed the truth a rare chance to be heard. And as the clapping ebbed and the show prepared to move on, JD Vance knew the conversation wasn't over. Not here, not beyond these walls. Because once the truth is spoken, it has a way of echoing far beyond where it began. The applause that had rippled through the room faded, leaving behind a quiet charged with something different now. Not discomfort, not performance, but a fragile kind of respect. The hosts shifted in their seats, the studio air thick with the weight of what had been said. For a moment, no one seemed eager to speak, as if the next words might risk undoing the honesty that had briefly overtaken the set. But then, as JD expected, came the final challenge, the effort to steer the conversation back to safer, more familiar ground, to frame his truth as sentiment rather than solution. One of the co-hosts, the one who until now had watched more than spoken, leaned forward slightly. Her voice was smooth, measured, her expression carefully composed, but her question carried the edge of argument beneath its polished surface. "Senator Vance," she began, "I think everyone here respects your passion. We respect the people you're speaking for. But, and I ask this genuinely, shouldn't we be focusing on the future? Shouldn't we be investing in new industries, new technologies, instead of trying to hold on to what's already passed?" It was framed as fairness, as pragmatism, but JD knew what it really was. The old, familiar dismissal dressed in polite language. The idea that the people he spoke for were obstacles rather than builders, that their time had come and gone. He could feel the weight of every steelworker, every farmer, every small-town teacher and shopkeeper in that question. And he could feel the expectation that he would answer with either defensiveness or retreat. But JD Vance did neither. He met her gaze steady and direct, and when he spoke, his voice was sharp. Yes, but respectful. The voice of a man who understood that truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. "The future," he said, his words clear and firm, "can't exist if we abandon those who built it." The silence that followed was deeper this time, more thoughtful. The camera caught the co-host's face. Not offended, not angry, but thoughtful, as if for the first time she heard the weight behind the words. JD didn't stop there. He leaned in just slightly, not to confront, but to connect. "I'm not against new industries. I'm not against progress. But real progress doesn't leave people behind. Real progress builds on what's come before. It honors it. The men and women who worked those mills, who farmed those fields, who kept small towns alive. They gave this country its foundation. If we tear that down, if we say they don't matter anymore, then what exactly are we building on?" His voice softened then, not out of weakness, but out of conviction. "The future I believe in doesn't forget its past. It learns from it. It lifts it. That's how a nation stays strong." For a long beat, the studio stayed quiet. The co-host, hands folded on the table, gave the smallest of nods. Not agreement, perhaps, but understanding. And that, JD knew, was a start. Beyond the cameras, the nation watched. And JD Vance's words began to ripple outward, beyond the bright lights of the set, toward the people who'd been waiting too long for someone to say them. JD's final words. "That's how a nation stays strong," lingered in the charged quiet that followed. For a long moment, no one moved. The lights still burned hot, the cameras still rolled, but the usual rhythm of the show was gone, replaced by a hush that felt bigger than the studio itself. And then it happened. Soft at first, almost hesitant. A murmur from the audience. The kind of sound that rises not from obligation, but from recognition. From the truth of something that's been felt but left unsaid for too long. A man near the back, gray at the temples, hands folded on his lap, nodded slowly and began to clap. His applause was steady, unhurried. A quiet thank you from someone who understood. Beside him, a woman followed suit. Then another, and another. What began as a ripple became a wave. The clapping grew louder, firmer, not the forced kind that answers a cue card, but the kind that answers conviction. A few stood, hesitant at first, then taller, as if reminded of something they'd nearly forgotten. The pride that comes from seeing dignity defended. JD didn't move to claim the moment. He didn't smile or gesture or bask in the approval. He sat still, letting the response be what it was. Not for him, but for the people he spoke for. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the studio, beyond the hot lights and polished surfaces, the world was watching. Clips of JD's words, his steady voice and firm gaze began to spread. First in small circles, then faster. On social media, a phrase emerged, sparked by a viewer's simple caption beneath a shared clip. Hashtag respect the heartland. The tag caught fire, shared and reshared, attached to images of mills, farms, small-town main streets, families at kitchen tables, places and people who, for a moment, felt seen. The hosts, caught in the unexpected swell of the audience's reaction, exchanged glances that spoke of their effort to regain control of the conversation. One cleared her throat, leaned forward, tried to ease the energy back to familiar ground. "Well, Senator, we appreciate the passion," she said, her tone measured, reaching for the show's usual balance of civility and distance. "But let's talk solutions. What would you say to those who argue that these ideas—" But the room had shifted, and they knew it. The hosts' voices no longer held the easy authority they had at the start. The narrative no longer belonged to them. JD met her gaze calm as ever. He didn't rush to answer. He let the applause fade, let the moment breathe. He understood, as did everyone watching, that something real had cracked through the surface today. And as the cameras continued to capture the scene, as the hashtag climbed and the nation leaned in, JD Vance knew this was no longer just about one interview or one studio. It was about what came next, and who would have the courage to carry the truth beyond the lights. The applause, real and unprompted, slowly ebbed, leaving behind a stillness that felt different now. Not strained or awkward as before, but full of something deeper, something closer to understanding. The hosts, usually quick to fill a silence with their voices, held back, their practiced ease replaced by the unspoken awareness that the tone of the morning had shifted beyond their control. JD didn't rush to speak. He let the quiet settle, knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing one can do is leave space for truth to take root. When he did speak, his voice was low, steady, not triumphant, but sincere. "I didn't come to fight," he said, his words clear and simple, reaching not just the host before him, but the millions watching beyond the cameras. "I came to remind." There was no boast in his tone, no trace of gloating or victory claimed. JD knew that this wasn't about winning an argument or scoring a point. It was about planting a seed, about saying out loud what too many had kept quiet for too long. The producers, sensing the moment's natural close, cued the music gently, the familiar theme rising beneath the lingering hush. The lead host recovered first, offering a polite thank you that didn't quite meet the moment's weight. The others followed, their words courteous but cautious, as if unsure how to wrap a conversation that had veered so far from the day's expected script. JD rose as the segment drew to its end. He extended his hand first, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the space they had shared, however difficult. One host shook his hand with genuine warmth, her earlier skepticism softened by what she had witnessed. Another accepted it hesitantly, her grip light, her expression polite but guarded. A third met his hand with a nod, professional, measured, still processing. JD didn't linger. He understood that the real work wasn't in this studio or in these handshakes, but in what would happen next, in how the conversation they'd started here would continue beyond the bright lights and scripted breaks. As he stepped away from the table, the cameras followed him for a final moment, capturing his quiet exit, the set behind him now just a backdrop, no longer the center of gravity. Outside the view of the lenses, a young crew member, no older than the steelworker's son JD had spoken of, offered a small nod of thanks as JD passed, a gesture that needed no words. And beyond the walls of the studio, beyond the reach of the lights and the applause, JD Vance's message had begun to travel, carried not by the noise of argument, but by the steady pulse of a truth that had found its voice. The lights of the set faded as the segment ended, the music rising to cover what words could no longer hold. JD stepped away from the table, from the cameras, from the faces that had once seemed so certain and now sat quieter, more thoughtful, still turning over what had passed between them. The studio's hum returned, the soft shuffle of crew resetting, the whispered directions, the distant clatter of a new segment beginning. But for JD, the world beyond that stage felt different now. He crossed into the wings, the bright glare giving way to the cooler shadows of the backstage quarters. Here, away from the set's polished veneer, the people behind the scenes waited. The cameramen, the stagehands, the assistants who kept the machine running but were rarely seen. They didn't speak at first, but as JD passed, their silence wasn't the kind that avoided, it was the kind that acknowledged. A few gave small nods, gestures of respect that needed no words. One or two offered soft claps, brief but sincere, the sound of hands that recognized not a performance, but a truth spoken aloud. JD accepted it all quietly, offering a simple nod in return, his pace steady, his mind still turning over what had just unfolded. He had come into this place expecting challenge, expecting perhaps even to be outnumbered, outmaneuvered. What he had not expected was this, the quiet, the stillness, the sense that what he had said had landed where it needed to. As he neared the exit, a voice stopped him. Soft, almost hesitant. "Senator?" JD turned. It was a young intern, no more than 22, clipboard hugged to his chest, nervousness in his eyes. He stepped forward, as if drawn by something he hadn't planned to say. "Thank you," the intern said, his voice low but clear. "My dad's from a town like that. Thanks for saying what you said." For a beat, the noise of the studio beyond seemed to fade. JD saw in the young man's face not just gratitude, but the quiet relief of someone who had long wished his own story could be spoken out loud and had just heard it for the first time on a stage like this. JD didn't offer a speech in return. He placed a hand briefly on the intern's shoulder, a simple gesture, steady and true. "Tell him he's not forgotten," JD said. His words meant not for the cameras, not for applause, but for the only audience that mattered in that moment. The intern nodded, eyes shining with something unsaid, and JD continued on, his steps measured, the weight of the moment carried not as a burden, but as a promise kept. And as he left the studio behind, the lights, the sets, the noise, JD Vance knew that sometimes the real impact of words wasn't felt in the applause or the headlines, but in the quiet places where truth meets memory and finds a home. The quiet that followed JD's walk through the backstage halls didn't last long. Not beyond those walls, not beyond that moment. By the time he stepped out into the crisp morning air, the world beyond the studio had already begun to stir. It started as it often does now. A single clip, grainy at first, recorded off a television screen by a viewer who couldn't believe what they'd just witnessed. JD's calm voice, his steady gaze, his simple declaration, "I didn't come to fight. I came to remind." It spread with a caption that spoke for millions. Finally, someone said it. Within minutes, more clips followed. From every angle the broadcast had offered, from official feeds and amateur recordings alike. Snippets of JD's words about the mill, about Miguel, Susan, and Dave, about the future built on the shoulders of those who came before. The hashtags followed. Hashtag respect the heartland. Hashtag Vance on the view. Hashtag dignity matters. Each gaining speed. Each drawing more eyes. Headlines race to catch up. Vance silences the view. Senator's quiet rebuke goes viral. J.D. Vance, voice of forgotten America. Cable networks rolled the footage on loop. Commentators debated, dissected, praised, or questioned, but the momentum belonged to none of them. The message was already in the hands of the people, being shared, repeated, remembered. J.D. watched none of it. His phone buzzing constantly now with interview requests, offers for exclusive reactions, invitations to primetime panels. He let it ring. Let the messages stack up unanswered. He'd said what needed saying. The noise that followed wasn't what mattered. When his staff pressed, gently at first, then with more urgency, that he should respond, that he should seize the moment, he shook his head. "It's not about me," JD said simply, the words as steady as they had been on that stage. "It never was." Instead, he sat at his desk, the steel pin on his lapel catching the afternoon light through the office window. In front of him lay a stack of letters, real letters, paper and ink, from people who'd watched, who'd heard, who'd felt seen. He opened them one by one. A retired miner in West Virginia who wrote of his pride. A schoolteacher in Pennsylvania who shared how she played the clip for her civics class. A young mother from a town JD had never heard of, who wrote simply, "Thank you for making them see us." JD read each line, not skimming, not scanning, but listening with his eyes, with his heart. When he replied, because he replied to every single one, his words were his own, not drafted, not polished. The story that had begun in a studio under bright lights was now carried forward in the quiet spaces of connection, from one forgotten town to another, from one family to the next. And as the headlines roared and the internet raced ahead, J.D. Vance stayed rooted in what had always mattered most. The people who had trusted him to speak when it counted, and the promise that no amount of noise could drown out. The sun dipped low over Washington as J.D. sat at his desk, the day's light softening into gold that spilled across the papers before him. The phone still buzzed from time to time, screens still blinked with notifications, requests, reactions, headlines that shouted louder than the message itself. But J.D. let them pass. His focus stayed on the letters, each one a voice that had reached for him not through noise, but through quiet courage. His fingers paused over one envelope. Plain, no return address beyond the simple scrawl, Ohio. Something about it drew his attention, the handwriting careful but unpracticed, the kind that comes from someone who writes because they must, not because it's easy. J.D. opened it gently, unfolding the line paper inside, smoothing it flat with hands that knew the weight of words like these. "Dear Senator Vance, I watched what you said on TV. My daddy was watching too, though he didn't say much. He worked at the steel mill before it closed. I was just a kid when that happened, but I remember how he used to walk a little taller back then. After the mill shut down, he didn't smile as much. He tried for me and Mama, but it wasn't the same. After we saw you on TV, he sat a little straighter in his chair. He didn't say a lot, but I saw it. I saw it in his eyes. You gave my daddy his pride back. I just wanted to tell you thank you for that. We don't have much, but we have that again. God bless you." Sarah W. J.D. read it twice, the words plain, unpolished, but truer than any headline that day. He could picture her, Sarah, young, maybe grown now, maybe still in that small town where the mill's hum had once been the backdrop to every childhood memory. He could picture her father too, not because he knew him, but because he'd known so many like him. J.D. folded the letter carefully, as if the paper itself carried the weight of the pride she spoke of. He rose, reaching for his coat draped over the back of his chair. His fingers found the inner pocket, where a small steel pin had rested for years. The pin his grandfather had given him, worn smooth at the edges from years of being carried close. Without a word, JD slipped the letter in beside it. The paper and the pin, memory and promise, the past and the duty that came with it. The room grew quieter as the sun slipped lower, the last light catching on the Capitol dome in the distance. JD stood there a moment longer, the letter's words echoing in the quiet. He hadn't sought applause. He hadn't sought headlines. But this was why he'd gone on that stage, why he'd spoken when it would have been easier not to. For Sarah, for her father, for every family waiting for someone to say out loud what their lives had long proved. And as the night drew in, J.D. Vance felt the weight in his pocket not as a burden, but as a reminder that pride, once restored, must be carried with care. The city had settled into night by the time J.D. found himself walking, alone, far from the hum of his office, far from the chatter of headlines and the glow of studio lights. The streets were quieter now, the rush of the day giving way to the hush that only Washington's monuments seemed to command. His steps took him toward the Lincoln Memorial, the great figure seated in stone, watching over the city, watching over generations. The moon hung low and full, casting a silver wash over the marble steps, the columns, the quiet power of a place built not for noise but for remembrance. J.D. paused at the base, his eyes lifting to meet Lincoln's steady gaze. The flag nearby caught a breeze, its fabric snapping softly, the stars and stripes rippling against the dark sky. He stood still, listening to the night, to the sound of his own breath, the faint rustle of leaves, the distant hum of a city that never fully slept. The weight of the letter in his pocket felt heavier now, not as burden, but as reminder. Sarah's words, her father's unspoken gratitude, the faces behind the places he'd spoken for. They walked with him tonight. He thought of the studio, of the bright lights and sharp smiles, of the laughter that had tried to dismiss the truth he carried. He thought of how easy it would have been to answer anger with anger, mockery with mockery. But that wasn't the way. That had never been the way. Truth didn't need to shout. It only needed to stand. J.D. drew a slow breath, the cool night air filling his lungs, steadying his heart. He let his gaze drift across the quiet stretch of the mall, the monuments rising like sentinels beneath the stars. Courage, he reflected, wasn't in the fight for its own sake. It was in speaking when silence would have been safer, in standing when it would have been easier to sit. The flag rippled again, the moonlight catching the silver edge of its fabric, and J.D. Vance turned at last, his steps slow but sure, walking back into the city that waited, into the work that remained. Tonight there had been no stage, no spotlight, only memory, only duty, only the quiet promise to keep speaking for those who too often went unheard. The night's quiet reflection beneath the marble gaze of Lincoln lingered with J.D. as he returned to his work. But beyond him, beyond the city, the words he had spoken traveled further still. What had begun in one studio, in one moment, began to ripple outward, not in grand headlines now, but in small, steady ways that mattered more. In a town square miles from the Capitol, where the paint on storefronts had long since faded and the old mill's smokestack stood silent against the sky, a mayor spoke to a packed community hall. The building was modest, the chairs worn from years of use, but the people filled every seat, their faces marked by the lines of hard work and harder years. The mayor, a man who had grown up in that town, who had watched neighbors leave when jobs left, stood behind the podium, his voice steady, his message clear. "We can't change everything overnight," he said, pausing to meet the eyes of those who had stayed, who had built their lives in streets others had forgotten. "But as Senator Vance said, the future can't exist if we abandon those who built it. That means us. That means now." The crowd listened, not with cheers but with nods, with the quiet understanding of people who knew what it was to hope and what it was to work for what they hoped for. And in a high school not far from that town, in a civics classroom lined with maps and old posters about rights and responsibilities, a teacher dimmed the lights and played the clip. The students watched JD's face fill the screen, watched him speak not in slogans, but in truths that reached across the years and the miles. When the clip ended, the teacher didn't speak at first. She let the room sit in the quiet that followed, let the weight of it settle. Then she said simply, "This is what it means to stand up." The students, some leaning forward on their desks, some staring at the screen as if seeing something new, nodded, not because they understood every word, but because they felt what mattered. And so, as JD walked the city's quiet streets that night, his words walked elsewhere too, in halls and classrooms and hearts that, for a moment at least, felt a little less forgotten. Morning broke slowly over Washington, the first light of dawn casting a pale gold across the quiet city. The Potomac stretched out like glass, its surface touched by the soft breath of a breeze that carried the promise of a new day. JD stood alone at the water's edge, the world around him just beginning to stir, the hum of the city not yet awake. The river moved with its steady, unhurried rhythm, reflecting the soft pinks and blues of the sky. Across the way, the monuments rose against the light, silent, solid, reminders of those who had stood before, who had spoken when it mattered, who had carried the weight of truth with no guarantee of applause. JD took in the scene, the cool morning air filling his lungs, grounding him after all that had come before. The voices of the night, the applause, the quiet nods backstage, the words of Sarah's letter, the echoes of that community hall, the civics classroom, all lingered with him now, carried on the breeze like a quiet chorus. He thought of the laughter that had tried to dismiss him, tried to shrink what he'd spoken for. It had seemed loud in the moment, sharp and sure, but now in the hush of the morning, it felt distant, small, the kind of sound that fades as quickly as it rises. And then he thought of what had lasted, the nod of the stagehand, the whispered thanks of the intern, the letter in his pocket, the small-town mayor's steady voice, the teacher's quiet lesson, the dignity that could not be laughed away, that would not be forgotten. JD let his gaze rest on the water one last time, the flag nearby catching the dawn breeze, its fabric rippling gently, a soft salute to the day. And as the sun climbed, casting its light across the river, he found the words that had waited for this moment, simple and sure. Laughter fades, the dignity of a people doesn't. He let the thought settle, not as a declaration, but as a promise, one he would carry as surely as the pen and the letter in his pocket. And then, as the city awoke and the day began, J.D. Vance turned from the river, his steps quiet but sure, the victory not in noise but in the truth that remained. The screen faded to black, the quiet victory, the lasting one. This story reminds us that true strength doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from standing firm for what matters, even when it's easier to stay silent. J.D. Vance's journey wasn't about winning an argument or seeking attention. It was about giving voice to those who too often feel invisible and proving that dignity can't be dismissed by mockery or forgotten by progress. His quiet victory is a reminder that real change begins when we listen, speak with purpose, and carry the truth forward, no matter the noise around us. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a moment where you had to stand up quietly for something or someone who mattered? We'd love to hear your story. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.